Okay, here we go on the next stage of the next aspect of our coverage of unemployment. We've already established that unemployment is a more complex concept than what we typically regard in everyday conversation. Unemployed means being out of work, seeking work, and available, willing to work for the going wage, willing to accept the going wage. We got into the broader scope of things in terms of the population which gets counted with the population that doesn't get counted, so as to define the civilian labor force, and then realize from that labor force there are two groups: the unemployed properly conceived and the employed. The unemployment rate, therefore, is the number of unemployed persons divided by the civilian labor force. Okay? Now, in this video, this part of the unemployment lesson, I want to go over the types of unemployment that economists conceived, and the first one I mentioned in the prior video. It's called frictional. The economy has friction. Friction, like rubbing two sticks together. The economy, a capitalist economy especially, is dynamic. It's always changing. That's normal. And in fact, that might be the easiest intuitive understanding for frictional unemployment. It's normal. There's always going to be some unemployment, some unemployed persons. In a certain way, it's desirable. You don't want people to feel stuck in their jobs as though they have to remain there for 30 years. And of course, there are different stages in life. There are periods where you want part-time work rather than full-time work, and vice versa. So, real life normally has some unemployment in it, right? And the economy normally has some unemployment in it. So in the end, when you're in these periods of switching jobs, looking for jobs, economists call that a period of job search. Some part of the population, some part of the civilian labor force is always going to be unemployed for that reason. I mean, for the typical college student, there's two examples. Say you're not working during the school year. You finish your semester in May. You want to get a job for the summer. And that was the typical pattern when I was in college. For many, anyway. And so in April, you start looking for work. You start looking in April, suddenly you're an active and willing participant in the labor market. You're going to get counted. You're an unemployed person, just by the fact that you've begun searching and are willing. Okay? But you don't find a job on the first day. It may take 3 weeks. It may take a month. Hopefully it's a short period. But there will be some time. So when the Bureau of Labor Statistics does its survey, it finds that a certain population is in this category. They're just changing jobs. So they might have some period of unemployment as a result of that. Or they may have just gotten fired and they're unemployed for that reason. Maybe they've moved. They're in transition. Maybe they just quit. They felt like quitting and they were a little disgusted with their employer or what have you. So I guess they're kind of changing jobs, right? There could be health reasons, health factors. Whatever the case may be, it's fairly normal that some relatively small part of the population is in this category. In the United States, we say it's 4 to 5%. When the unemployment rate hits 4 or 5%, basically we believe the economy is as good as it can perform. It's performing as well as it can. So, that's pretty easy. Next, there is a kind of unemployment that goes above the frictional and is not so pleasant. We refer to it as cyclical in reference to the business cycle. This is the kind of joblessness that's associated with recessions. Through the history of the United States, growth in GDP is about 3%, real growth. That's an average, steady rate, but real life is not so average and steady. There are boom times. Like in the 60s, there were some years we measured that had growth rates in 6%. There was the Star Wars period. 1984's growth rate we measured to be 7.5%, right? In those times, obviously the economy's doing very well, and either we'll get maybe even below 4%, or the unemployment rate will drop quickly. But then there's the opposite, the recessionary periods, where it'll be difficult to find a job. So this is joblessness, again, associated with recession. And so any number above 5% for sure is indicative of a recession period. Associated, don't abbreviate associated. Associated with recession. Over and above the normal frictional rate. In the prior section of the unemployment video, I mentioned that unemployment got as high as 9.5%, almost 10%, 2009, 2010. So that's 4 or 5 percentage points above the normal, the frictional rate. That was a very bad recession. We're still at 7.5% unemployment, so we're still suffering the after effects. We're still in the hangover period, so to speak, of that huge recession in 2008. As the economy improves, obviously, we'll get closer and closer to the frictional rate. All right, so conceptually that's pretty easy. But, I mean, on the surface, I just want to make this one point. On the surface, a person out of a job looks like a person out of a job, and they all look the same. But statistically, we can make these differentiations. You're going to have some normal, but anything above that, that's a sign of a recession. Or it might be a sign of another thing. And so there's this kind of grayish sort of category that's hard to explain, hard to conceptualize, but you run into it. It's distinct. That kind of unemployment is called structural unemployment. So I'm going to try to define this first by examples so that you can get some sense of what situations we're talking about, and then define it more rigorously, the way you would need to know for a test. But let's give you some examples, and all the examples are kind of distinct too. So there's subcategories of structural unemployment. Let's say you're a doctor trained in the 1970s or 80s. When you were a doctor, when you were trained, I should say, when you were trained, there were just x-rays. Say you're a radiologist. So you learn how to do x-rays and read x-rays and such and such. By the mid-80s, and certainly through the 90s, radiology went to another level. They developed CAT scans, MRIs, a host of other kind of diagnostic tools for looking inside the body and detecting what might be wrong. At any rate, if you're a radiologist trained in the 70s, you're mid-career, new technology is being introduced for new detection means or methods, you got to brush up. You got to retrain. If you don't retrain, the hospital where you work they might fire you and you'll be out of a job, maybe for a long time, maybe for a period longer than 6 months. And it's simply because you somehow chose not to retrain yourself, and you became a less valuable employee, and then were let go. That's one example. Just another kind like that. A secretary. 1960s, 1970s, and maybe early 80s. Learn and train and work a good portion of the career on a manual typewriter. But by mid-1980s, the office is getting computerized. We're well into electric typewriters, but then into PCs. And the office technology is changing. Record keeping is changing. And the secretary has to keep up. If that's you, and you don't keep up, you don't retrain yourself, you're going to be like the radiologist who didn't retrain and learn the MRI and CAT scan techniques. You're going to be structurally unemployed. All right, so these are, two kinds of things where there's some kind of retraining involved, right? Because of the job itself and the skills required to do that job have changed because of, technology. There's even a case where you have this kind of technological displacement. That's what it would be called. There's technological displacement, and sometimes the jobs sort of don't come back. Like retraining is not enough. In fact, retraining is kind of a moot point. A good example of that is the case of a UAW worker, United Auto Workers, a guy that worked on the assembly line in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Even if he has 10 years left to work, once robotics comes in, this guy's in trouble. Because his job is being replaced, technologically displaced by the automation at the car factory. That's one of the reasons why the United States manufacturing base has eroded over the past 20, 30 years. The method of manufacturing things has become automated and created structural unemployment for those that were skilled in those areas. So as I say, it's not so simple for a UAW worker to retrain himself because the job is not there, not to be done anymore the way it would be for a doctor or a secretary. The job that's kind of replacing the UAW worker is like a computer programmer, a designer, a computer architect, something totally different. A programmer. So these are three cases, all involving some aspect of technology, right? That often results in what we call technological displacement. And that's just one subcategory. There are others. Here's another group of examples. In the United States, unemployment rate for PhDs, I'll say presently, we're in the recovery phase of a recession. PhD's unemployment rate today will probably be about 4.1%, I'm guessing. Master's degree, MA or MS, that rate will probably be about 3.9. These aren't statistical quotes. I haven't looked these up recently, but that's what they'll be in this environment. Bachelor's degree, BA, BS. Bachelor's degree, probably around 4.5, 4.8, a little higher. If you have associate's degree, we can't abbreviate associates. Associate's degree, associates in arts, associates in science. That rate, you'll probably get a 7%. You might get an 8. Remember, right now the current rate is around 7.5. Then the big stuff starts to happen. If you have a high school diploma and nothing else, your unemployment rate now might be like 10%. And heaven help those who have less than the high school diploma, because their rate will be something like 14 to 15% today. Those two statistics out in the end say a lot. And the two at the other end say a lot. In the modern economy, education matters. And it affects the ability for you to find gainful employment. Even in good times, even if the unemployment rate overall were, an ideal frictional 4%, you'll get PhDs 3%, masters 3%, you'll get BAs around 4%. But even in the best of times, high school degree, 7, 8. Less than high school, 10, 11, 12, even in the best of times. So, education matters. Finally, a final example. I won't read it out. A final example of structural employment might be regional conditions. There have been times in the United States where the Southwest had a recession, where the Northeast had a recession. In the past, in the recent recession, Florida, Arizona, Nevada, parts of California felt the recession even more than, say, we did here in the Northeast, because it was so much a real estate sort of a real estate initiated recession, and in those areas, the boom was even greater than it was here in the Northeast. And so, consequently, the recession was deeper in those areas. So you can have regional episodes occurring. Some may say that international competition can create a structural unemployment. So, more or less they can. And that's where all the fuzziness begins. Because when exactly does someone get reemployed and get beyond this structural thing? Well, they're not pure categories. It can often happen that someone winds up structurally unemployed as a result of the recession. In fact, this recession is kind of a good example of that. The recession occurs, there's a quick adjustment by firms, there's a lot of laying off, and as time goes on, the firms finally determine, we don't want this job here anymore. We're not going to organize our outfit like that anymore. We're going to be more efficient and use this manager for this and this manager. We're going to combine work, and jobs don't come back. It's been seen, especially in mid-level management positions in this recession. Certain jobs haven't come back, even though the economy has recovered or is recovering. So those jobs that don't come back, that's exactly where we find the structural unemployment. The recession could be a trigger, and then it sort of morphs into something else. So there is kind of like a little rule of thumb that if you have this period of unemployment that lasts more than 6 months, this is going beyond the cyclical kind of thing. Now you're talking about what? A real structural problem. It's a fascinating sort of investigation for economists to try to figure out and sort out what unemployment is caused by the recession and which is caused by even broader forces. That's kind of the common denominator. The denominator here in these examples. There's different forces than just purely supply and demand, aggregate supply and demand, driving this kind of unemployment. There's technological factors, which involve engineering and advancement of science and all such a thing. There's education factors. There's social factors. They're not quite as simple as wage matters, demand matters, income generation matters, that are so frequently associated with the cyclical forms of unemployment. So, knowing these examples and having an intuitive sense about them can provide us the key insight and understanding to make a proper definition of structural unemployment. We'll say it occurs when there's a mismatch between